I'm Karen Engel. I teach at the law school, and along with Neville Hode, who's somewhere on one of, he's up high too, at least on my screen. Along with Neville Hode, co-direct the Bernard and Audrey Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice. And it's really my pleasure to welcome you all here, and especially Carrie Freshour to welcome you back, and actually to welcome you back, Christine Williams, as well. So Professor Carrie Freshour from the University of Washington will present her talk today, From Chicken to Broiler, Unraveling the Snarl of Centuries. And Professor Christine Williams from here at UT will offer a response. As some of you may know, we host a colloquium every fall on human rights and inequality, and it's also part of an interdisciplinary seminar that we teach in the law school, open to students from around campus. And this year I'm teaching it with Rappaport Center's postdoctoral fellow, Nina Ebner. And she joined us this fall after completing her PhD in geography at the University of British Columbia. We have an amazing group of 12 students in the class, and they have all read a fair amount of Carrie's work. We read it for our class last week, alongside some work by Cedric Robinson, Walter Johnson, and others on racial capitalism. And some of them have written reaction papers. And I think after the response and a response to the response, and we open up to the floor, which we'll do and have a lot of time for everybody to engage, we will allow the students to have the first few questions. So before I introduce our speakers, just a few logistical notes. We have set this up intentionally as a Zoom meeting, not a webinar, so that we can actually engage in conversation with each other. You are welcome to leave your cameras on during the talks. We find that sometimes speakers like having audiences, even in the Zoom world. But even if you don't do that, we would ask you to turn them on during the Q&A. To avoid distraction, we ask you to hold your question until all our speakers are done. And you might say, well, of course I'll do that. But I say that because we will invite you to be able to ask your questions through chat, either by spelling them out or having a request to speak. And I'll say more about that when we get to that point. If you're watching on YouTube, feel free to post questions there, and we have someone monitoring them who will send them to me. So with no further ado, by way of formal introduction, Carrie Freshour is assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Washington. Her work focuses on low-wage food and agricultural labor in the US South, on racial capitalism, carceral geographies, and Black radicalism. Carrie's finalizing a book project, titled, at least for now, titled Making Life Work, and it's a great title, so I encourage you to keep it, which centers the organizing and other experiences of Black women, their families, and broader communities in Northeast Georgia, who remain the basis for the global production of cheap chicken. Her work is partly shaped, she has said, by growing up in rural Northwest Georgia. And I think she's joining us from Georgia now. Is that right? So she's published on these themes in a number of places, including Antipode, the Monthly Review, and Society and Space. She's also currently working on a documentary, which is why she's in Georgia. And I think she'll tell us a bit about that and maybe even show us some of it today. Although this is Carrie's second appearance at the Rappaport Center, it's her second appearance virtually. She spoke at our pop-up institute over the summer on care work, and we were really looking forward to meeting and hanging out with her in person. COVID has prevented that this time, but we're going to keep trying. So after Carrie speaks, we will hear from Christine Williams, who is professor of sociology and the Elsie and Stanley E. Skinny Adams Senior Centennial Professor in Liberal Arts here at the University of Texas at Austin. Christine's research focuses on gender, race, and class inequality in the workplace, and in fact, in a number of workplaces. Her most recent book is out this year from UC Press, and it's called Gaslighted, How the Oil and Gas Industry Shortchanges Women Scientists. And it explains why the industry remains white, male dominated despite decades of diversity policies. Christine's also the author of numerous book chapters and articles, and another book that I just like saying the title of, Inside Toyland, Working, Shopping, and Social Inequality. We always feel fortunate to have Christine in our conversations. She has been busy over the past few years doing lots of things, including chairing the sociology department and being president of the American Sociological Association. But I noticed, Christine, those all say past on your resume. So we're hoping to be able to find ways to take up more of your time. So thank you both for being here. And we will begin with Carrie. And maybe everyone could join me in welcoming her.
Thanks, everyone. I'll share my screen now. Let's see. Great. All right. So thanks for allowing me to spend some time with y'all today, and especially to Karen and Nina for bringing us all together. They've been extremely generous in preparing me for this talk. So I really am especially grateful for y'all. Thank you to Professor Williams for being the discussant for today, and to all the students who read and engaged with my work for their class, especially to Shreya and Molly for writing those response papers. So I'm calling in from Creek and Cherokee lands, as Karen mentioned, outside of Atlanta, Georgia, in a town called Athens, Georgia. And my heart and life's work remain here in the US South, in rural North Georgia, and in a place I'm building relationships to and learning so much from. That's the Mississippi Delta. And for today, I'll be reading much of my talk. I hope that's okay, moving in and out of field notes, but I'll try to mix it up with some nice visualizations and some audio. So it's still dark out by the time I arrive at the plant. In the first few months, I bike about 3 miles from the east side, following the bends of the Coney River. The air is crisp and cool, and I feel a sense of accomplishment for being up so early. With each car that passes, I wonder if they too are heading to the poultry. Entering the building, the fluorescent lights of the plant shake me awake. There's a busy energy at the start of the day as we gather in locker rooms, put away lunches, and pick up supplies, readying ourselves to process anywhere from 80 to 140,000 birds that day. We rush to get on the line by 6:15, relieving women from the night shift. And the speed with which I get to my station determines Miss Mary's mood as we exchange places. If I'm a little early, she smiles at me and tells me, "Good morning, baby." If I'm just barely on time or late, her eyes pierce through me with annoyance and anger. And by my second shift drawing the birds, I learned how to pull out the insides while keeping gizzards intact, how to distinguish sick from healthy birds, and how not to bust my ass trying to catch every bird when line speeds are high. This is the second day of what will be an almost 6-month stint working at one of the largest chicken plants in the state of Georgia. And while friends and colleagues considered this an accomplishment, although my goal was to make it 10 months, most women I interviewed after leaving the plant were unimpressed. And one woman, Derica, even busted out laughing at my little time at the poultry. But this was a humbling experience, to say the least. It's there that I began thinking about time on a very intimate scale, how time disciplines workers with automated line speeds to pace the movement of workers tied to lines. I also began thinking about the unevenness of time, how time is taken from people not only during the workday, but also in the long term, through the often debilitating effects of paid work. And finally, I saw and experienced how people snuck away time, refused the regimented time of the line, and carved out and shared time. And this led me to question the differences in people's time sense and how ideas about time differentiate people and places as being on time, ahead of or behind time, and out of time. So through ethnography and thinking with Du Bois and others, I try to make sense of how time is structured, time's relationship to place, and how time discipline produces value under racial capitalism. So in this talk, I'll be working out some ideas I first attempted in the monthly review piece that some of you read, published last summer in a forum on racial capitalism. And there I tried to grapple with the connection suddenly made visible across poultry plants and prisons as COVID-19 hotspots, but in a way that looked beyond the surface of the concentrated and often state-sanctioned outbreaks. And poultry plants, somewhat like prisons, have provided solutions to rural economic development across the South, steeped in a long history of anti-labor and anti-Black violence. And throughout that article, I tried to establish the relationship of organized abandonment and a contested time work discipline to racial capitalist accumulation. What I hadn't quite worked out there, but am developing in a co-author piece with Brian Williams, which some of you read, is how carceral geographies undergird these processes. And today I'm going to focus in on questions related to an uneven time sense, asking how is time both an instrument and an ideology of differentiation for racial capitalism? What places and people are forgotten or made backward or left out of time? And what are the struggles and refusals over this time sense and more liberatory relations to time, work, and against racial capitalism? So the title of this talk, From Chicken to Broiler, addresses the transformation of the backyard bird to the industrial broiler, a process that occurred at neck-breaking pace, no pun intended. And in 1928, it took 112 days to raise a 2.8-pound chicken that ate roughly 12.5 pounds of food. By 1968, that time was cut in half, and by 1978, industrial broilers were 25% bigger than their predecessors, eating half the amount of feed. In 1995, the average broiler hit the scales at over 6 pounds in 47 days, eating only 10 pounds of feed. And this speed up required a transformation of growing out practices, of modernized and electrified chicken houses, selective breeding, pesticide use, and the chemicalization of feed, all dependent on lopsided debt-inducing contracts with growers.
Carrie, sorry to interrupt you, but your screen, we're only seeing like 2/3, I think, of what you're trying. Great. I just fixed it.
That's interesting. Okay, let me move. I think my notes are too large then.
Now it's still, we were missing the 2005 important image.
Is that better? You got it all?
Yes.
Okay.
Got it.
Sociologist Kathleen Schwartzman also found that over the course of this transformation in the hen house, productivity per worker tripled from 1960 to 1987, with profits increasing 14-fold from 1980 to 1990. These speedups brought the US to a prominent global position as the largest producer of chicken in the world, and the South produces the most chicken in the US. So the highest producing states being Georgia, Arkansas, Alabama, North Carolina, and Mississippi. And Georgia is the #1 producing state and has been for the last 38 consecutive years. It processes 1.2 million live chickens a week, employs 40,000 workers in processing alone, and contributes $42 billion to the state's economy. So what you see before you is an image from a 1962 time use study produced by the USDA to determine the most efficient worker movements in order to increase speed and productivity. And elsewhere, I've documented how time use studies, the drive for further processing, so think whole birds to the McNugget, and federally mandated line speedups work to sell time to the largely at the time white consumer while stealing time by producing what I call a premature disability for workers. Sometimes this is captured through OSHA reports and data, but often it's not. We can talk a little bit more about why in Q&A. Throughout oral histories with an older generation of workers, people talked about how these speedups were experienced, how they missed the good old days of the industry when they felt they had more control over their time. They could come in late and or hungover on Mondays after a weekend of fun. There were higher rates of absenteeism, and they could easily quit and return depending on their own needs. So in those early days, there was no clocking in, the lines did not move so fast, and there was much more freedom to cut up, to sing, to dance, and get through the day. And speedups in the industry have been historically tied to modernization drives and further automation in the plants. And this process has been supported through federal programs and inspections and is regulated through the USDA Food Safety Inspection Services. Through automation and federal deregulation, the poultry industry both lengthens the working day and speeds up production. And industry leaders like Don Tyson become easy caricatures of this productivist time sense, where value is created through mechanized speedups. And of course, the poultry industry is not the only industry to engage in such practices. Yet the non-uniform bodies of the birds provide a natural limit to full automation. So unlike other industries, manufacturing industries, the need for largely women's labor with debilitating effects remains. And several of you questioned sort of the gender division of labor within these plants. So from Jesse Jewell papers, so Jesse was the major innovator in the state of Georgia, and he was one of the first people to open up a processing plant in the mid-1940s. And he had this lawsuit filed against him from Amalgamated Meat Cutters, which is the major union trying to organize across that time. And in these papers, Jesse Jewell talks about who they depend on for the workforce, right? It's mostly women. The labor was considered women's work because of the size of the bird. And there was a thinking that it would require smaller hands and dexterity. And so there are all sorts of ideas about women's dexterity in relation to men's, and ideas about who's suitable for this work. So in the early days of the industry, when Black women were the minority of workers, they were still placed in the dirtiest jobs. They were segregated into what many workers referred to as the Black jobs at the plant. Today, more men work in the plants, but the gender division of labor, I think, remains with men in positions like maintenance, floor sweeps, live hang, and sanitation. So the subtitle of this talk speaks to a different and longer question of time, and its meaning borrowing from Du Bois's chapter of The Quest for the Golden Fleece, from Souls of Black Folk. His aim for this chapter and the one preceding it was to trace the transformation of the New South as a hub of industrial activity, but one still so dependent on the remnants of the Cotton Kingdom. And to do so, he argues one must honestly and carefully study the conditions of life for the Black farmhand in Dougherty County, stating, quote, "How little we really know of these millions, of their daily lives and longings, of their homely joys and sorrows, of their real shortcomings and the meaning of their crimes." And to understand the field hand, he argues one must understand the significance of this place as a rich land, quote, "devitalized by a careless and exhaustive culture," end quote. And this careless and exhaustive culture is the same culture through which dominant ideas about the future of development of the region and ultimately the nation would emerge. He concludes this chapter with a critique of what he calls the car window sociologist, who attempts to, quote, "understand and know the South by devoting a few leisure hours of a holiday trip to unraveling the snarl of centuries." To such men, very often the whole trouble with the Black field hand may be summed up by Aunt Ophelia's word, shiftless, end quote. So in other words, the passerby determines field hands are inherently careless and lazy and may only become better workers when their time is disciplined through what he calls the slavery of debt. So challenging such outsider views, he argues, quote, "They are careless because they have not found that it pays to be careful. They are improvident because the improvident ones of their acquaintance get on about as well as the provident. Above all, they cannot see why they should take unusual pains to make the white man's land better or to fatten his mule or to save his corn," end quote. So Du Bois critiques the role of so-called scientific research that fails to consider the broader conditions such as absentee plantation owners, a growing merchant class, and the continued denial of Black land ownership, while showing how ideas about time use uphold and reproduce racial differences, justifying punitive solutions to the post-emancipation labor problem. Yet here he also alludes to what scholars after him have called the Black radical tradition as a way of knowing the world through, and this is to borrow from Robinson, a quote, "revolutionary consciousness that proceeded from the whole historical experience of Black people." And so here, I think Du Bois is doing really fascinating work on political economy of the region, but also paying very close attention to history and culture of the Black Belt South. So over half a century later, cultural historian E.B. Thompson famously argued that capitalist labor exploitation depends not only on large-scale systemic change, so things like private property, weight, industrialization, but also on a reconfiguration of values expressed in the case of time work discipline through workers' changing relationship to time. And so he notes the shift occurring throughout Europe towards the end of the 17th century. In order for wage work to actually work, it had to be reconceptualized as belonging to the employer, whereas all things that workers do outside of the working day were reframed as wasteful and inefficient. And for Thompson, this devaluation is both gendered, represented through what he calls the laborer's wife, who maintains a pre-industrial sense of time, and racialized through examples of Mexican workers who return to their village for planting and harvesting as, quote, indolent and childlike people, end quote, whose lack of time discipline served as, quote, proof of a natural inferiority. And so these are not Thompson's conceptualizations, right, but he's borrowing from writers and historians of the day describing the process, as well as plantation workers in Cameroon who questioned the unending work without breaks. Time use differentiates people and places made backward in racial capitalist structuring of time. So disciplining this time sense was a crucial part of the process of what scholars call proletarianization, or the making of wage workers. So this is also, of course, tied to theories of primitive accumulation, moving people off of common land. So it's about the reorganization of time, but also space, people's ideas about and connections to particular places. So for the, just, you know, sort of illustratively, for peasants, maybe in this painting, right, to be compelled to work, they must be so through the threat of starvation and or criminalization. And in the paper with Brian, we work through these connections as carceral geographies tied to more modern ideas about productivity after emancipation. So more recently, Rasan Mahadeo helps us to see how time is unevenly distributed and practiced, how time is racialized and racist temporalized through a focus on young people of color and their time sense, as it relates to education and work opportunities, as well as their strategies to funk the clock, in his words, repositioning white people as behind the times. And by studying the punitive time of prisons as doing time, Damien Sojourner, building from Robinson, argues that time is both an instrument and ideology of Western civilization, which works to establish difference-making projects that attempt to legitimize race. So time sense in both cases, as Molly noted in their response paper, is subjectively experienced. Yet structurally, it regulates the quality and quantity of life. Both scholars also note the ways in which people seemingly left out of Western white time sense challenge commonsensical understandings of time. So these thinkers question the normative universality of a deracialized time sense that creates value through narratives of personal responsibility to instead peel back the layers of what such narratives conceal. The ways in which racial capitalist time sense produces difference, shapes aspiration, and justifies anti-life practices in the name of productivity. So I'll now try to bring these ideas about time back to the poultry plant. So throughout my work, I asked people what they knew about the poultry, how it influences the place, the state, the region, and what the industry's relationship is to working people. And so now I'm going to play a short clip with Lucy that captures a common response I heard throughout fieldwork. Whoops. Let's see.
Surrounding. I think it's great. It's a great thing to have in a town like Athens, where you have so many folks who are living below the income level. It provides a good means for a job. Mm-hmm. And from what I understand, and this may be just based on the folks I've talked to, as long as you're hardworking and put in the time, then they will reward you as well. So I think it's good to have a stable base for which they can employ so many folks. Mm-hmm. And I know that they do. So it makes me happy that they're here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's much higher.
So Lucy is the executive director of a local Christian nonprofit that distributes food and emergency funding. And her response represents a common view of the poultry for poor and working people who are expected to be satisfied with such jobs. If only people put in the time, which is tied to the proverbial idea of hard work, the poultry could potentially, maybe, provide some stability. Yet Lucy's job, like so many nonprofits, is dependent on the sustained poverty, and it's 50% in this region. And that's the rate of people living below the poverty line, and false promises of such industries. Here, ideas about hard work fall short, where over full-time leaves people well below the poverty line, often with bodies permanently impacted by the repetitive and monotonous work. So I'll now read a few excerpts from field notes outlining my first few days at the poultry and how attempts to discipline time begin long before working on the line. And I'll try to balance the text you see with on the screen with more detailed reading. So I was hired through the Department of Labor, AKA the Unemployment Office, through a routine batch hiring where nearly 100 people showed up looking for a job at the chicken plant. It was a chilly November day, weeks before Thanksgiving, shortly after my 28th birthday. And to be hired, you have to acquire a referral, which requires the time to make multiple visits to the unemployment office. On many of these visits, I encountered entire families present at the office, so mothers with infants and toddlers in tow. And for people within the city limits without reliable transportation, making this trip is a 1 to 2 hour endeavor, even though it's only a few miles from downtown. And many more travel from places way out in the country, over an hour away by car. So we gather in a large side room of the DOL to receive a short orientation on the advantages of working in the plant. We are also warned if anyone has been hired more than once, their application will not be accepted. There is a database, we are told, which keeps track of all these things. If any of us had a little too much fun over the weekend, maybe smoked a little and are unable to pass the drug test, the HR rep advises us, just slip on out the back and come back the following week when your system is clean. The room is almost entirely black, except for me and a few white men likely applying to be chicken catchers and mechanics. There are about twice as many women as men, and we are reminded that the chicken plant is one of the few places in town that hires people convicted of a felony. We all rush to fill out applications. Some people jump in the line to be interviewed while still hastily filling in the final lines of their packet. Interviews are less than 5 minutes, where representatives from HR screen us, asking, "What job do you want? Are you sure you want this job? It's tough work." They then scribble some notes and are finished with you. Already there is a stark contrast in the time invested by both parties. Later that afternoon, I receive a call back from HR. I am hired. Come on Monday, bring your ID and tell them to send you to Maria. So while my focus here is really on time discipline constructed and experienced throughout the workday, I wanted to take a moment to clarify some questions you had about carceral geographies and how these impact work at the poultry. So through the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Brian Williams, I think about how carceral geographies are not just about the confined spaces of the prison over there, but about all the ways in which prisons become catch-alls to our social problems, how the kinds of social relationships that are maintained and by them extend to other parts of our society. And here, of course, I focus on work at the poultry. I want to play a small clip from an oral history with Takia, who was in her early 30s at the time and had worked at multiple plants. Her words clearly get at the connections across the extension of the carceral state, anti-Black criminalization and policing, and work at the poultry.
That's what it seems like. Everyone knows someone.
Especially here, because that's all that they have, really, that will hire mostly blacks, I'm gonna be honest. Because the poultry is, they will hire you, I'm gonna say it like this, they're lenient, like if you have a criminal background, if you can't go nowhere else, you can go get a job at a poultry processing plant.
Yeah.
So a lot of times you get, a lot of people who got backgrounds and people who, you get what I'm saying? They hire just by anybody.
So this is yet another way that time is stolen from working class Black people like Takia and so many others looking for work at the poultry. And as Ruth Wilson Gilmore puts it, prisons enable money to move because of the enforced inactivity of people locked in them. People extracted from communities and people returned to communities but not entitled to be of them, enable the circulation of money on rapid cycles. So what's extracted from the extracted is the resource of life, and that's time. So here I'm thinking about how these prisons and poultry plants work in tandem in a lot of ways to do this work to extract time. So now I'll talk a little bit about the first few days of orientation at the plant. So I arrive at the security gate at 6:50, show the guard my ID, and follow the stream of workers into the plant. The halls are loud, active as people are moving in and out as shifts change from night to day. There are 9 of us waiting for orientation, 4 Black women, 4 Black men, and I'm the only Asian person. We are held in a small room to be interviewed by the director of HR and to fill out the remaining paperwork. All the other new hires will work the night shift with what labor scholars classify as antisocial work hours, the more popular of the 2 shifts. The night shift is known for having a higher turnover rate and a younger workforce, but people seem to prefer it as the less rigid. We wait for hours to do a physical exam and take our first drug test, the second disciplining measure we encounter after the security gate and ID check. Drug and alcohol use are monitored throughout your tenure at the plant, but really only matter during the initial days of orientation and later if a worker falls or cuts themselves. Blaming workers for their injuries is a common tactic, which leads to a general distrust of the plant nurse and underreporting. Drug tests signal that workers' free time cannot be used in any way that they wish. And people are nervous, worried they'll fail. I'm surprised by how many people have hidden urine on their bodies so they can pass this test. And one guy hears they make you take off your jacket, empty your pockets. The women are worried the nurse will do a strip search, and they will not let her do a strip search. One of the men who I later meet, Anthony, has worked 10 years doing live hang at a smaller plant about half an hour away. Another man with long braids, the first to arrive, is eager. I'm ready to make that 12 hours, just got to get through the first 45 days. He asks Anthony about the work, and Anthony describes the process and then says, you know that cliche, go to bed with the chickens, wake up with a rooster? And everyone laughs. I finally see the nurse, an older white woman in a pink shiny tracksuit, I think sort of 1982 era, who carries a permanent disdain for everyone. After a few, yes ma'am, she treats me markedly different than she treats the other workers, even complaining to me about everyone who comes in. He comes in here every day saying his arms hurt, but then laughing, smiling. If you're hurting, you don't cut up like that. She is antagonistic and distrusts the workers who come in, and I feel ashamed of her affinity towards me. The nurse's office becomes an unwelcome and even dangerous space of the plant. After I successfully pass the drug test, I leave the plant around 1, so 5 unpaid hours. We return to the plant the following Thursday for 2 days of orientation, and after we take photos for IDs, we sit in the waiting room for about 3 hours. We get called back to HR one by one for them to make copies of our ID and to fill out some tax forms. While we're waiting, the guy with braids tells everyone about how HR said he has to lose weight in the 45-day probation period. And Anthony says, we'll lose weight all right, bending and scooping chickens all day. So after everyone finishes the paperwork, we go through the plant, past the cafeteria, past debone, and up 5 flights of stairs to the training room. The room is large, rectangular shape with brownish walls and long tables with chairs facing a large pull-down screen. Along the walls are inspirational signs from the company about hard work and safety first. We meet with Kendra, a Black woman who worked on the line and made her way to the office. There's a general antagonism between us and Kendra, and she sends it right back, treating us as if we're children. We are kept in the room where we watch cheesy occupational videos, meet with union reps, and fill out even more paperwork. And so many of you were concerned with the role of formal unionization within the plant. And this plant that I worked in remains a UFCW unionized plant, although membership in the right to work state, as you all are aware of in Texas as well, remains quite low and the union is very weak. While I believe this plant has slightly better wages than 2 nearby plants that are non-unionized, the high rate of worker turnover also contributes to difficulty in a strong union. And most workers I spoke with were not a part of the union, and many didn't really trust the union or didn't want their $8 out of their check each week. So while working there, I was a part of the union, but only saw the rep a handful of times in the cafeteria. So after each of these short training videos, we have to collectively answer quiz questions using handheld clickers. And Kendra gives us the answers and threatens us throughout the process. If y'all mess up, I can tell who messes up and I'm gonna send you down to the office. After several hours of this, we get 35 minutes for lunch. And if we're late, Kendra will shut the door and not let us in. When we return from lunch, the training is even more torturous because the room is warm and our stomachs are full. Everyone starts falling asleep as the training continues. So one of the guys in the room starts falling asleep and Kendra gets on to him. If I see you falling asleep again, I'm gonna get Brittany in HR. You think we can't fire you before you even start working? Antoine, who stood up for a few of us earlier in the day, stands up for this guy falling asleep. He says, well, we understand, ma'am, but everyone is tired. You didn't make yourself known before. We are all tired, but he's going to be straight. And Kendra is clearly mad at this, but he speaks so calmly and has all of our support, and he diffuses the situation again. So we learn about all the ways we can get fired. Kendra says that the number one reason people get fired is because they don't show up for work and point out. And there are a lot of questions about the point system. We can get a point for missing a day, half a point for 4 hours or less. If we get 2 points in the 45-day probation period, we are fired. After that period, you can get 7 points and earn back points after 30 days of consecutive work. When we get to work, we have a 3-minute window between clocking in and getting to our station. So if you clock in at 6 and your shift actually starts at 6, then you're late and you get a half a point. If we clock in anyone else, we can get a 3-day suspension and maybe termination. And I later interviewed 2 women who were fired for this act of camaraderie, and many more who simply pointed out for being sick or taking care of children or elderly parents. So this time now belongs to the poultry. So from the first 2 days of orientation of the plant, it's clear that work at the poultry is in high demand, and just making it to orientation is cause for celebration. And many women I interviewed who were no longer at the plant kept an ear to the ground for hiring days. Several women who had worked at the plant before were fixing to start back again at the poultry, and this meant frequent travel to and from the unemployment office and rounds of paperwork. It meant catching rides, the bus, or walking a few miles each day. It also meant finding childcare or toting your kids along, all adding up to work for labor. Once hired, but before the work on the line, workers are tasked with long days, sitting in offices, waiting rooms, and orientation halls, as HR reps attempt to instill the plant's time sense. The threat of being fired during the 45-day probation period remains high, and as we are told by the union steward, Miss Henrietta, the office thought our group was way too ratchet to ever make it through this first 45 days. Every person I interviewed sought work at the poultry because it paid above minimum wage and did so every week, with several commenting on the need for other places like Walmart to pay every week. Although the money is the same either way, low-wage workers living check to check cannot wait. And this is often because there's a broader network of people who rely on them through informal arrangement, cash for childcare, transportation, and rent. And most women I interviewed and worked alongside lived in subsidized low-income housing where payments were made on a monthly basis. But for those who weren't able to get into these apartments or who were on the waiting list, and there's always a long waiting list, found makeshift housing in extended stay motels and neglected apartment complexes, paying weekly rather than monthly to skirt multiple security deposits. And these arrangements usually charge more than regular 1 or 2 bedrooms and make it so that low-wage workers with no savings or safety net can ever really catch up, much less get ahead. So through these brief observations, it's clear that workers moving in and out of the poultry are disciplined in a variety of ways in relation to their employment at the plant. But most often, the temporalities of their life's work are in conflict with that of their wage work. Getting hired at the poultry means that their life outside of work is immediately disciplined. Do better sleep when you're not working, better not drink or smoke on the weekends, better not get sick or have to do caretaking. Well, the actual policing of their time outside and the constant state of debt for many pushed them into the plants in the first place. As James Baldwin famously put it, quote, anyone who has ever struggled with poverty knows how extremely expensive it is to be poor. And if one is a member of a captive population, economically speaking, one's feet have simply been placed on this treadmill forever, end quote. So beyond orientation, over the nearly 6-month period I worked at the plant, rules and regulations were implemented in an attempt to ensure supervisor control over workers' behavior, bodies, and their time. Time or lack thereof became a common theme throughout observations and oral histories. There's never enough time to get on all the gear, to eat lunch, to draw the birds, to use the bathroom, to trim every breast, to cook dinner, to even sleep. Time is controlled at the plant through speed, the speed and pace of the line, the point system, and supervisors' watchful eye. The temporalities of the plant not only shape people's working lives, the 8 to 11 hours they spend inside, but also have effects on their time and freedom when they leave the plant, what workers often refer to as their real lives. So for Thompson, workers' time since had to be controlled in order to establish that time now belonged to the employer, whereas all things that workers did outside of the working day were viewed as wasteful, lazy, and inefficient. And this is especially true and contributes to the devaluation of women and their work. This work is both necessary and inevitable, not external to racial capital accumulation. Yet by the logic of capital, women's very emphasis on their time outside of work pushed back against the sort of time work discipline necessary. For Thompson, they lived through an imperfect sense of time. And for women at the poultry, similar contestations remain over the working day. And as previously mentioned, this was often the cause of conflicts with supervisors and the cause for pointing out. In spite of the difficult and debilitating conditions, the strict enforcement rules, and the monotony of the working day, women carried out small acts of survival, resistance, and sometimes refusal in the plant. And this was most visible as women expressed care and concern for younger workers and passed along strategies for survival against the monotony and pain. Due to my own positioning within the plant as a comparatively young, naive, and out-of-place Chinese girl, as I was often referred to, I was on the receiving end of many of these acts. Women were quick to share food, and this was an important act in light of for-profit and overpriced cafeteria food. And this is a plant practice that mirrored the fringe banks outside. So workers could use their ID card as credit to be withdrawn from their next check. So a chicken patty sandwich and fries might be $7.45. You add a Gatorade to that, it's $10.85. And easily within a week's time, this could add up to $50 from your check. Although we all complained about the price and quality, it was easy and warm, some comfort during a hard day when most women didn't want or have the energy or time to cook. But our group tried to support each other to stay away from that food. So when someone had very little, another would give them part of their food. Soup one day, mac and cheese the next, tacos another, and often this was coordinated and planned throughout the week. While unnoticed by the plant, cooking demonstrated an act of care that was also a way to reorient time outside of work. In addition to these social material offerings, workers shared strategies to take care of one's body against the line speeds. So workers use experiential knowledge to estimate the length of the working day by sharing information about the number of birds and their own calculations of line speeds and bird health. This allowed them to coordinate with children and/or second jobs and gain control of their time. So in the plant I worked, if there were 130,000 birds and the pace of the line was good, we might get out before 2 p.m. If there were over 190,000 birds, no matter the pace, we probably wouldn't get out until after 5. And so workers would also steal time by clocking in early, taking longer breaks, working a leisurely overtime, and sometimes even walking off the line. And this is a tactic I'm discovering more and more through oral histories and archival exploration, so that walkouts, sometimes sanctioned by a labor union, but often not and against the union's wishes, constitute a major form of protest for Black women poultry workers throughout the South. Occasionally, workers would inadvertently work with management to speed up the line and decrease work stoppages, not simply to consent to discipline, but to hold on to what little time outside of work they may have with what little energy the shift didn't take from them. Notably, this also meant sharing one's labor so the slow pace of one person's work didn't impact the rest of us. So during one particularly rough week when I caught a bad stomach virus that had swept the plant, Miss Margaret noticed my discomfort during break and my struggle to catch all the birds. She took over for me several times, helping draw the birds, easing my workload, and giving me a much needed break. And because of her seniority in the plant, our supervisor did not reprimand her from taking time from sorting livers to help me. So additionally, workers on the line shared stories, jokes, dance moves, and songs to keep each other entertained through the working day. And this helped pass the time a little more quickly. And these strategies while on the line were especially skilled and provided very small moments of reprieve and escape. This included telling jokes, mocking supervisors, inventing games, playing with chicken parts, and making beats on the metal equipment. Sometimes it meant singing gospel and showing off dance moves. So workers are not passive recipients of time disciplining strategies and often defy their positions as mere appendages to speed ups and automation. While no large-scale organized labor action occurred during my employment, workers practiced what James Scott calls everyday forms of resistance. And these actions are essential to understanding how and why more formal, large-scale labor actions might and do emerge. These forms are diagnostic of power, reflecting how workers understand their relationship to power, embodied by line leaders, supervisors, USDA inspectors, union reps, HUD managers, police, and de facto social workers. These actions are not to be measured on a continuum from everyday acts to union strikes, but rather, as Robin D.G. Kelly argues, the relationship between Black working class info-politics and collective open engagement with power is dialectical, not a teleological transformation from unconscious accommodation to conscious resistance. Sorry, that was a quote. Theft, foot dragging, food sharing, rule breaking, dancing, singing, the destruction of property, absenteeism, tardiness, easing up, and faking it all reflect the daily strategies to steal, take, and redistribute time for Black workers at the poultry. And while everyday acts in and of themselves do not present systemic challenges to capitalist disciplining of worker time, as many of you are curious about this ability for such small acts to impact racial capitalism, they are both diagnostic of power and have the potential to lead to coordinated and collective social change. And these workers have not fully accepted, nor will they ever fully accept, the categories of time demanded from their employers reflected in racial capitalist conceptions of a deracialized time sense. They also signal to me ways in which workers challenge the difference-making projects of time that attempt to legitimize race, and that's to quote Damien Sojourner. Poultry workers are not alone in being on the receiving end of this type of work discipline, nor are they alone in presenting resistance and refusals to such enactments of a racial capitalist time sense. Yet I think what we might learn by thinking of poultry plants alongside prisons, alongside Amazon warehouses, is that these modes of discipline and attempts to steal life's vibrancy, creativity, and collectivity through time work discipline work through instruments like the clock, new forms of artificial intelligence, and are supported through ideologies that sort people into hierarchies of human worth, dependent on how one uses one's time and places into those fit to host a prison or a warehouse or a poultry plant, and those fit to host Amazon headquarters. As I hope I've shown in this talk, contestations around line speeds might expand to center the issue of time, that is to broaden critique, resistance and refusals to the instruments and ideologies of racial capitalist conceptions of time, emboldened by Dolly Parton's recent flip of her famous song 9 to 5 to 5 to 9, and the competitive sleep deprivation celebrated by high power CEOs, and to extend and build with Black workers who move against this form of time work discipline. I focus on time to draw out what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls knots of connectivity across newly identified essential workers, I'm putting those in quotes, and to the many of us who feel our lives are being sped up at a tremendous and breakneck pace. Might we pick up the call of labor movements of the past, like the worker action movement operating in North Carolina's Gold Kiss plants in the 70s, who pushed for 40 hours pay for 30 hours work, toward more control over our labor time, refusing the structuring of time sense as a way to differentiate people in a racialized hierarchy of human worth. Might we remember the Black field hand who long ago refused the, quote, unusual pains to make the white man's land better, or to fatten his mule, or to save his corn, end quote. Or the 50 workers in Kathleen, Georgia last year who walked out saying enough is enough, to engage what Joshua Myers calls a Black radical time against the practices of difference making and othering. I think I could stop there, and if y'all want to talk a little bit about the documentary, I have a few clips I could show for that as well. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Carrie. Christine.
Hi, Carrie. Thank you so much for that talk. That was fascinating. And the rich details that you shared with us are really so impressive. And as a fellow sociologist and ethnographer, I just really want to applaud the effort that went into this. And of course, I have all sorts of questions about how you did it and what did they think of you while you were there? Or, I mean, all of those nitty gritty questions would be so fun to ask, and to hear from you about. But what I'm going to do instead is just ask some sort of general questions about the work that you did and the implications of your work in a larger perspective. As Karen said when she introduced me, I'm I'm a sociologist who specializes in the study of social inequality in the workplace. I've got a special emphasis in my work on gender and race. I've explored discrimination and homophobia and sexual harassment in a wide range of employment settings, including the military and the retail industry, and most recently in the oil and gas industry. I'm not an expert on time, nor am I an expert on food pathways, but I've learned a lot from your work, and it certainly resonates with a lot that I do know about the labor market. Professor Freshour takes us into slaughterhouses where Black and brown people, mostly women, kill and package chickens. Her research reveals the incredibly harsh conditions of this labor and the toll it takes on the bodies of the workers. In her study of chicken factories, Professor Freshour documents the workings of racial capitalism. Capitalists thrive when they divide workers on the basis of race and ethnicity. This differentiation helps them pit workers against each other while keeping wages low, profits high, and working conditions subhuman. In the chicken industry, undocumented immigrants were once the ideal workers precisely because they had no labor rights. Immigration raids in the past 2 decades resulted in the deportation of many workers. This forced the industry to troll for a new market to exploit. They found what they were looking for in formerly incarcerated people of color. In Georgia, where this study took place, chicken plants were one of the few employers that hired ex-felons, as Professor Freshour points out. I understand that Lowe's and Home Depot were the others. Now, this study reveals that not only is capitalism racialized in its search for the most docile workers, it's also gendered. The preferred workers in these chicken factories are women of color. One of the questions I had for Professor Freshour is exactly this. Why are these women the preferred employees? Now, you mentioned that in the past, preferring female workers was part of a union busting strategy. That's news to me and really interesting. Because of course, most unions were white male dominated and they got to control who were the preferred employees. So hiring women was a way to go up against the unions. But I'm wondering today, with the unions being weaker, why are these women the preferred workers? And I wonder if this is also true at Lowe's and Home Depot, or if they prefer to hire male workers for also gendered reasons. Although Professor Freshour is most interested in questions of time and place, how the specific context of Georgia's political economy shapes the labor regimes of chicken plants, there are universal themes in this research that I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about. In particular, I want to draw attention to 3 of these universal themes. The first theme is that every commodity has a history. This means that everything that we consume has a past. A chain of decisions were made about everything that surrounds us. Someone had to decide to produce this thing. Somebody had to decide how to make it and who was going to make it. More decisions were made about packaging, transportation, retailing, how to get the thing to the consumers. Then there's the question, why did I buy it? Why did I, as a consumer, decide to purchase this thing? Now, sociologists who explore commodity chains attempt to answer all of these questions. In general, we find that the closer you come to the manufacture of goods, the point of production, the harsher the conditions for labor. The people who produce the stuff that we all consume often labor under the worst exploitation. And the people who profit from and consume these products are geographically removed from the point of production. And as you point out, time-wise, they're removed as well. A second universal theme, extreme exploitation is debilitating and dehumanizing. Workers suffer physical and psychological harm from this exploitation. Professor Freshour documents this in her research, emphasizing how the labor discipline in the factory negatively impacts all aspects of a person's humanity. In this regard, I have a question about slaughterhouse work. Both the workers and the animals are treated with harsh brutality at the plant. I was wondering when I read this if these practices were related. Can we imagine a labor system that treated workers well, but where animals were still treated cruelly? I wonder if they go hand in hand. I suspect that despotic working conditions might be required to coerce people to work in this environment. How else could a factory kill 175 chickens per minute? The flip side is also interesting. If capitalists were forced to treat animals well, would they, as a consequence, also be forced to alter their labor practices and treat their workers well? Do the two, in other words, go hand in hand? The third theme I'd like to just briefly address is the fetishism of commodities. As consumers, the information about how our stuff is made is typically hidden from us. Marx described the fetishism of commodities as a key element of capitalism. The entire apparatus of advertising is intended to titillate our basest desires as it shields us from the exploitative conditions of production. Capitalists want us to think that Kentucky Fried Chicken is made by grandfatherly Colonel Sanders, and I love that picture that you had from the 1960s. Or else they tell us that the animals really want to be eaten. There's a chain of restaurants in Austin called Happy Chicks. I pretty much doubt that the chickens are happy or happily sacrificing themselves for our enjoyment. That is why your work is so important. It lifts the veil of racial capitalism and shows us the brutal working conditions that make possible our enjoyment of chicken McNuggets and chicken filet sandwiches. So which brings me to my final question. Can your research cause consumers or the industry to change? Will this study successfully challenge these labor practices? Will it cause consumers to stop eating chicken? Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle over a century ago to draw attention to the appalling labor conditions that were in the Chicago slaughterhouses. The book resulted in some necessary changes. Most importantly, it resulted in mandatory inspections of slaughterhouses. But Sinclair himself was disappointed. He complained that consumers were more upset by the prospect of eating putrid meat of mistreated animals than they were at all concerned about the mistreatment of workers. So my question for you, Carrie, is, as scholars, what can we do to keep attention focused on the plight of workers? So those are my questions. I once again just want to congratulate you on this important work, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Christine. Carrie, those were just some tiny little questions for you, but they're for all of us, I think, as we go into the discussion too, but I want to give you a chance to respond and maybe kick off that next part of the discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Williams. This is such a beautiful response, and I appreciate all of your questions as well. For your first question on why are these women preferred? I mean, I think the students had a similar question, right? Why is it that, is there a way to think about the gendered nature of this work alongside of this process of racialization for the workforce, and how do we think about these at the same time? I think, you know, it's tied to the history of the workforce and ideas or stereotypes about who should be working there. Like I mentioned, from the very earliest days of the opening of poultry processing plants, but even pre-existing this industry takeoff, raising birds, backyard birds was often considered women's work. Some of the most famous initial innovators were women like Cecilia Steele up in the Delmarva Peninsula. But then over time, as the work became more, became modernized and tied to scientific ideas of science and progress, to put very simply, I mean, we could talk about the specificity of that transformation. There are leading white men throughout the history of this industry who have taken it on and become the sort of innovators, and led poultry science departments. UGA has a giant one that's been very influential, alongside of Cornell University, which is kind of, I think, a really interesting coincidence across both of those spaces intellectually, but the history tied to the scientificization maybe of the industry was also tied to those land grant institutions. So there's kind of this gendered division of labor within the history of the industry itself. So who were the vertical integrators, who were the furnishing merchants, who were the folks who decided to develop and sell and package feed, seed, and chicks and distribute those, compared to who actually grew them out initially. But then today, why does the industry continue to rely on mostly women? I would say, I think there are still ideas about who should be working in particular positions. Men do work in these plants. Like I said, they're usually free floaters. They're the people who clean up in the second shift. And they're almost always the live hang folks. So the people who pull the chickens off of the trucks and hang them by the shackles, right? But I think that it's also tied to gendered sort of divisions outside of the workplace, and what propels so many of the workers that I talk to into these plants is because, alongside of maybe having a record or not, they're also single mothers or grandmothers who need to provide for young children. And so I think that's another sort of gendered impetus to work in this kind of industry. And just sort of offhandedly, when we talk to a few men who have worked in and out of this plants, and their ideas about who can do this kind of work, and it's not really men's work, but they're also, for many women, and this is not only, I think, in my study, but I've seen it in other related places in the rural South, for industries that are mostly dependent on Black working class people, right? Men are often removed from the formal labor market. And we see that, I think this is one of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's big arguments, that how we think about the connection of carceral geographies to labor is this relationship of the removal and sort of catching of generations of unemployed men from sort of manufacturing blue collar work, right? And so I think this has effects on the gendered nature of the industry today. To your other, there's so many great questions. I think about the question of the commodity and why consumers buy it and continue to buy it, even though I think most of us have seen reports on this industry, right? Or you've seen, Oxfam had a big thing in 2016. There have been multiple films that have talked about the role of the exploitation of workers on the line. I think Raj Patel was here, or might still be in the room, right? But his work has documented these connections of cheap meat and cheap labor and cheap care. So what I think there's so much information about the industry and the way that it mistreats workers and animals, and yet I still feel like things are not changing. People are still eating chicken or the rate of consumption of chicken has actually increased. So I guess the reason I'm trying to connect the dots from sort of abolition work to labor movement work in these plants to social movements that maybe in defense of Black lives, right, is a way to reorient or reframe the industry to think about other touch points where people might actually care. Because I think it's a difficult thing. There's just so much information, but very little has changed, or things have actually gotten worse. Then finally, the question about workers and animals, I would suggest someone else. I think Alex Blanchett, if anyone is aware of his work, he worked in Omaha, or not Omaha, but a Nebraska pork processing facility where they both grow out the pigs and slaughter them. And it was a very giant complex. And he looks at sort of the ways in which biotechnologies within those complexes shape worker-animal relations. And he asks very, I think, much more focused questions on the relationship between animals and humans, or more than human animals. And he's also, I don't know if you would call it a multi-species ethnography, but to me, that's kind of what motivates his work, where I was really, really focused, maybe with blinders in some ways, on the workers. Let's see, and then your final question about the fetishism of commodities. Yeah, I guess it connects to what I said earlier about people consuming chicken. I mean, even within the within this place, right? I'm in Athens, Georgia. I'm in a college town, and there are 3 large chicken processing plants within like a 60-mile radius of this town. But most people, especially if you're not Black and from Athens, you don't know about the chicken plant. And so I think this idea of the plants being hidden in plain sight is just sort of, it's just taken for granted, despite the poultry science department even being located at the university. And, you know, down the street from the university, you see this giant USDA facility. The plant is only less than a mile from the university, right? But there are people and places that remain sort of out of sight. And there are all sorts of ways that I think, you know, this is facilitated through sort of social networks, but also through the physical sort of landscape of the place, alongside of, you know, these racialized histories of who actually works there and has any touch point with the industry. But yeah, I think I'll stop there and see if I can connect to other questions, or if other folks have comments, thoughts.